Good morning, ladies. Welcome to the fourth week. We've well over halfway through this course now, and I'm pleased to report that I'm pretty happy with the way that you're all performing. I think I can say with a high degree of confidence that all of you, without exception, should pass this course. Now I can say that because you've done 2 assessment items now, and even if none of you do well in the 3rd quiz, nearly all of you have got sufficient marks now, given that there's a weighting of 60% on these 3 quizzes. Nearly all of you have got across the line, and you're just now looking to see what kind of grade you can get. This does depend, of course, on you continuing to maintain the level of effort, and I think if we can take a bit of pressure off and I can convince you that you're all going to pass, it's then a question of you getting motivated enough to go for a higher grade. So good performance by all of you in the 2nd quiz. I think most of you improved your performance on the 1st quiz. A few of you didn't, and I wouldn't be worried about that because you were still getting high scores. So that's not anything to worry about. But I would just like to take a step back this morning and draw a breath and think about how we're going to organise ourselves in this final week or so, and what you might be doing strategically in order to maximise your chances of getting the highest possible grade. And I think, I can never be sure, none of us can be sure that you will all pass the course at this point in time, but I just would tell you that on the basis of my experience, you're all in a very good position. And I guess what I'm trying to say is you've got to work really hard now to fail, right? If you just carry on doing what you're doing and try and improve upon what you're doing, then you're going to give yourself a good chance of getting a good grade for this course. And that's your primary motivation, right? You want to pass and you want to get a good grade. My primary motivation is to get you to learn some economics that sticks in the head after you finish this course and can actually be useful to you in later life. So if we can try and find a way that satisfies your objectives and my objectives, then everybody's going to be happy. Which brings me to this first presentation today. We're going to be looking at aggregate demand and aggregate supply in the second half of this morning's class. And before we do that, because it is an important section of the course coming up, today's presentation and Tuesday's presentation are very important for what you'll be doing in the final assessment item when you take part in this simulation game, the macroeconomy simulation game. And I want to introduce this assignment this morning. I'm not going to talk about it in a huge amount of detail. I will next week. Next Sunday I'll go into a lot of detail because that's when we're going to start working on it in a big way. But I just want you to start thinking about it today, and that hopefully will motivate you to focus hard on the content that we're looking at this week, right? So we're looking at macroeconomic modelling today, introducing this concept of building a model of the macroeconomy, and then we're going to look at applications of that model on Tuesday, all right? And specifically how monetary policy and fiscal policy can manage the macroeconomy, and that essentially is what this macroeconomic simulation game that you're going to be involved in next week, that's what it's about. Okay, Ali's asking the question whether it's individual or group. It's both, actually. You'll start off, as I'll explain a little later, you'll start off working in a team, and a portion of your grade for this final assignment will be on your team performance, but the majority, the large part of the grade, I think it's 75% of the grade, is on what you do as an individual. Okay, and this brings me to what we're going to talk about this morning. I was happy with your performance in the second quiz, but all of you will have noticed that the short answer questions I put in this time were a little bit different to the short answer questions that I had in quiz 1. Very deliberately so, and I'm trying to build on your skills, your attributes, your knowledge, your understanding, slowly but surely. And the first thing I want you to do is just to get your head around the content of the course and make sure you have some good, solid, conceptual knowledge. But then I want you to start thinking a little bit more analytically about what you're doing, okay? Because at undergraduate level, when you get to university, it's not sufficient to just learn about facts, okay? Now, when you're at school, it's all about memory, all right? It's about memorizing dates and names and all these kinds of things, which you can cram in your head, hope it stays there long enough for you to data dump when you get into an examination, and then shortly after that you forget what it was you tried to memorize. So I want to emphasize, first of all, that we do need to have some facts and figures in our heads to work with, but once we've got some critical mass of knowledge, some critical mass of information, then we can move on to more interesting, I think, and hopefully you think as well, more interesting discussions about what it is we're focusing upon. Okay, so what I want to talk about first of all this morning is the importance of critical thinking in higher education. And I've got a great quote on screen here, which when you read it for the first time may seem a little bit confusing. Critical thinking is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to make your thinking better, right? So there's a word for this. It's called metacognition, okay? Cognition is about understanding, it's about learning. And if it's metacognition, it's recognizing that you're learning. It's recognizing that you are thinking about your learning. Okay, now this is all going to sound a little bit abstract, but another word which some of you may have come across, and maybe some of you actually try to practice, is mindfulness. You heard of this word, mindfulness? Just give me a yes or no in the chat box if you've heard of the word mindfulness. Okay, a few of you. All right. Well, mindfulness is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to make your thinking better. Okay, so a lot of us, perhaps all of us from time to time, get a little bit down, right? Sometimes we're in a good mood, but other times we could be in a bad mood. And there'll be a lot of us amongst that group who, from time to time, we get into a bad mood and we stay in a bad mood, right? It's a symptom of life, modern living, right? But if you can exercise mindfulness, so if you, for example, you can learn to recognize a negative thought, all right? And you go, aha, that's a negative thought creeping into my head. So what I need to do is change my strategy and think about something positive that will get rid of that negative thought in my head. This is a very simple example of exercising mindfulness. It's thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to make your thinking better. So that kind of thing is good for your mental health, your mental well-being. It's also very useful for critical analysis. Okay, so thinking about your thinking in economics and questioning yourself, okay, so that's a statement of fact on this page, on this screen, and I'm thinking about that statement of fact in a certain way, but could I be thinking about that statement of fact in a different way? Is there a different interpretation to that apparent statement of fact on screen? Okay, if you can make that transition then and recognize what it is required, then you will be in the process of becoming a good, effective critical thinker. So let's look at a few examples. You'll hopefully remember this question from the first quiz, question 21. The first short answer question in the first quiz. So what I put up here was a table of figures for a hypothetical two-good nation of vegans. All right, so there's only two goods produced and consumed in this economy, tofu and quinoa, and we can use this table of figures to calculate nominal GDP, real GDP, the GDP deflator, and then calculate the inflation rate. What you see on screen there is an example of a structured problem. All right, it's a question that only has one right answer. Okay, so I'm asking you in this question, calculate the percentage growth rate in nominal GDP, all right, between 1 year and the next. That is a structured question that is asking you to give a structured answer, and then typically there's only one answer. Okay, now much of what you have done in your educational experience, both at school and possibly at university, is stuff like this. Okay, but unfortunately the world is not as simple as this. And what typically happens in life, whether it's your personal life or whether it's your professional life, is that instead of structured problems, we get unstructured problems. This type of problem, structured problem, is an example of positive economics. Okay, so a positivist inquiry is one where there isn't any debate. All right, so I can ask you a question, calculate the unemployment rate, you can go and find out what the unemployment rate, how you do it, and you can give me a single answer. This is positive economics. Okay, you'll have done this in the microeconomics course. Question 21 in quiz 2 was a little bit different. All right, both questions in quiz 2 were unstructured in nature, or at least they had significant elements of unstructured problems. So this time I'm saying, suppose an economy has 40 million people, there are 5 million people who are unemployed and 20 million people are employed. Now on the face of it, that looks like it might be a structured question, but if you read the question carefully, there's an element of doubt in it, right? There's a few grey areas, and many of you picked this up immediately. You thought, okay, let's see if I can calculate the unemployment rate. What information do I have? And you may have actually started doing the calculation, and then you might think, hang on a second, there's no reference in this question to the labour force. I can't calculate the unemployment rate unless I know the size of the labour force, right? And then you might have got over this by saying, okay, well, if there's 5 million unemployed and there's 20 million employed, if I add the two together, then that must be the labour force. Okay, so many of you did this, and then you simply calculated, well, 5 million and 25 million means there's an unemployment rate of 20%. Some of you got it wrong and put 25% because you forgot to add the two together to get the labour force in the first place. However, you are making an assumption that by adding the 5 million to the 20 million, that that is what gives you the labour force, right? The key phrase, and we did this in class, and I asked you the question, what is the key phrase when we're trying to determine whether someone is a member of the labour force? And the phrase was actively looking for work, willing, able, available, actively looking for work. Now, what you could then talk about, and only a small number of you did this, was say, your answer to part A to this question was, no, I don't have enough information to calculate the unemployment rate because it doesn't give the labour force, right? There's a number of different ways you could have approached this, and I was giving you a mark if you said yes or no. And I gave you another mark if you explained why you said yes and why you said no. Those of you who got good marks, not only did you say yes, no, and this is the reason why, you said yes, no, this is the reason why, and other information that would help us to get an accurate figure for unemployment would be to understand what the level of disguised unemployment is. Is there a large number of discouraged workers in this economy? Okay, which then we can say that the unemployment rate is 20% on the information given to us, but if we knew more about the labour force survey and the number of the estimate for discouraged workers, in actual fact, the unemployment rate, the real unemployment rate, may be much higher than the official unemployment rate. Or you could have mentioned, yes, there could be 20 million people employed here, but we don't know anything about the level of underemployment. Are 30% of those 20 million employed, are they only part-time employed? Would they actually be interested in having more work than they have? Because they might be employed, but they're not earning enough money to feed their families. So that seemingly harmless statement, suppose you've got an economy with a population of 40 million, 5 million are unemployed, 20 million are employed. There's a lot more we can read into that statement. And this is critical thinking. This is where critical thinking comes in. It's thinking about your thinking while you're thinking to see if you can make your thinking better. Okay? So, whilst most of you did better in the multiple choice questions, I mean, you all got really high marks. Some of you, a good proportion of you got 20 out of 20. And the rest of you were sort of high teens upwards. But where you didn't score so well was in the short answer questions. Maita is maybe having problems with sound. Is anybody else having problems with sound? Yes, no, please. Okay. Maita, you might need to move to a different position in the house or something to try and get a better signal. Okay. All right, so just moving on now. now I've made this this point about the importance of critical thinking. This is an example of normative economics. All right, so look at the way I've asked the questions here. Do you have enough information to calculate employment? When you get a question like that, it's an open-ended question. If you compare that to the question I asked you in quiz 1, I just said calculate nominal GDP. Right, that's very, very clear. It's a very clearly defined question requiring a clearly defined answer. But when I start a question like that, do you have enough information? Do you, don't you? It's an open-ended question. And then the second part, explain what you need to do to calculate the unemployment rate. So then that is inviting you to talk about all of the challenges of calculating the unemployment rate and how sometimes it might be overstated, sometimes it may be understated, and there's an official way of calculating unemployment, and then there's debates about the validity of that official rate. So, on screen now is the section 6 of the syllabus, and you've now done test 1 and 2, quiz 1 and 2. We've got another one a week on when is it? Thursday. A week on Thursday. That'll be the third test. And just to remind you, I'm only taking your best 2 scores. So if you did bomb out on one of the quizzes, then you don't need to worry, because I'm only going to take your 2 best scores of the 3. This Thursday, no. A week on Thursday. Alia's saying, please make it easy. I always make it easy. Right. The project, highlighted in yellow here, is students will play as competitive teams in a macroeconomics simulation game. Each student will submit an individual written reflection at the end of the game. Right? Now, just before we go any further, there's a few of you with connection problems this morning. If you look at the top right-hand corner of your screen, you will see a button that says help. Don't click on that help button, but just to the right of that, it should have some green bars. Now on my screen at the moment, I have 5 green bars, which is telling me that I have a good connection. How many green bars do you have, Maita? Okay, Alia's got 4. Okay, so a few of us have connection problems this morning for some reason. I don't know why. We're just going to have to try and do as best we can. And those of you who are experiencing difficulty, maybe try and move to a different part of the house or something. I don't really know what to suggest. But if you've only got 2 bars, Maita, you're going to struggle a little bit, I think. Let me progress. At least there's always this recording for you to come and revisit afterwards. So let me talk a little bit about this simulation now, and I have a video to show you, which hopefully you'll be able to see.
up your economics class, get students more engaged in their learning, and improve student learning outcomes? Then try Econland, a simulation game that practices all the major concepts taught in a macroeconomics course. In Econland, students manage the economy of a country for 7 years in the face of fluctuating global economic conditions. They take monetary and fiscal policy decisions in order to achieve outcomes that matter to the population, including GDP growth, unemployment, inflation, and the budget deficit. Each round, the results are summarized in an approval rating that the population gives to the government. Learning takes place through hands-on analysis and decision-making, thereby turning students into engaged and active learners. But Econland is more than a simulation game. It also contains a learning platform with easy explanations of macroeconomic theory, a quiz, discussion forum, an online economics newspaper, and more. With a license, students can play the simulation game as often as they want for 6 months. Instructors have the ability to view student results for their class and to change critical parameters in the simulation model if they wish. Use of the Econland can easily be tailored to different levels of students, ranging from high school to university students to working professionals. The game is rich and flexible, but not complex. If you're a professor or teacher at a recognized institution of education, you can try Econland. Just ask for your free trial account now.
Okay, so that's just a brief snippet of what to expect with Econland. I think that you'll enjoy doing this. I think that probably 90% of you will be thinking, oh, I don't know enough about macroeconomics to do this. I'm going to be terrible at this game, blah, blah, blah. But the fact of the matter is, my experience over the years working in high schools and universities in different parts of the world is it's only by doing economics that you actually truly learn the essentials, right? You don't truly grasp what monetary policy is and what fiscal policy is until you get the chance to role play the person who is, or one of the people that is actually managing the economy. And it's, by seeing the consequences of your actions that you then start to understand how these things work. You understand the dynamics, for example, of what happens to the economy when you raise interest rates and what happens to the economy if you increase government spending and so forth. So if you go to Blackboard, don't do this right now. Badger is asking the question, when can you see your quiz 2 answers? They should already be there. It should all be visible. Let's talk about that a little later if you're having problems. But I've made it so that everybody could see all of the answers that you gave and whether they were correct or not. At least I'm fairly confident I did. But just returning to this assignment and the rubric that's attached to it, you can view this rubric in a number of ways. You can view it by looking at this set of PowerPoint slides, but in Blackboard, on the left-hand side, in the left-hand navigation bar, there are 2 places you can view it. One is rubrics. If you look at the assessments, there's a section there on assessment rubrics. Or if you click on grades, you'll see when you click on the assessment item, the final assessment item, there is a hyperlink there which will take you to this rubric as it appears in Blackboard and how I will see it when I come to grade the work that you submit. Now, again, based on my experience, the vast majority of students don't look at assessment rubrics. They might glance at them and think to themselves, oh yeah, it looks a bit too complex, you know, I'll just do the assignments and hope for the best. But if you look very carefully at what you need to demonstrate, the evidence you need to provide to me, or any examiner for that matter, the evidence you need to provide to get a particular grade, then I think this is a big help. Now, I'm saying this now, there are currently 25 people in this meeting room of a class of 28. Even though I'm saying this and recording it, still you won't look at it, all right? There'll be a number of you who will and a number of you who won't. Please be one of those people that does look, all right? Because if you know what it is that the examiner is looking for, then you're giving yourself a much better chance of getting a higher mark. Okay, so I'm putting it here. There's so many places you can look at this rubric. In the PowerPoint, in the grades link in Blackboard, in the rubrics link in Blackboard. So there's no excuse for not knowing what you need to do in order to do well in this assignment. Just very quickly, and I'm not going to go into this in detail today, just very quickly you can see that there is a grade for the simulation approval rating. What this is referring to is the performance of your team. All right, so the game, at the end of the game, you will get an approval rating, how well your government has done managing the economy. Most of you are going to get a high grade for this, right? Because you're going to have multiple opportunities to do the game. You'll get better at it. You'll start to understand how the economy works. So I fully expect that the majority of teams will be getting A or a B. All right, you're going to be in this range here, which means that you're already going to be giving yourself a good start in terms of getting a high mark in this assessment item. All right, so this is what you get as a team member, right? The team score you all get. That's 25% of the entire mark. And then you've got 4 criteria: the clarity with which you explain, the relevance of your explanation, the quality and depth of your analysis, and your self-critique. Now, all 4 of these criteria are essentially you demonstrating your powers of critical thinking, okay? Because the game itself, the result of the game itself, whilst you will get a grade for how well you've done in managing the economy, nearly all of you are going to get a high mark because you'll have plenty of practice, right? What's way more important is understanding why you got the approval rating that you did, right? If your government did very well, you got a high approval rating from the general public, okay? Do you understand why you got that high approval rating? Or indeed, if you didn't do that well, do you understand why you didn't get high approval from the general public about the way that you manage the economy? So what I'm saying, in other words, is that you can do the game well or you can do the game badly, but the majority of the marks are about your critical reflection on how well or how badly you did. You could do poorly in the game itself and do really well in the critical reflection because you understand why you didn't get the performance that you were setting out to achieve. Okay, so 75% of the marks for this assignment relate to your critical reflection as an individual, Anna, not as a member of the group. All right, so the game is done as a member of a team. The critical reflection is done as an individual. Okay. you will benefit from working as a member of a team. I know many of you go, oh, sir, Professor, I don't like working as a member of a team. Can I do it as an individual? The answer is no, because guess what? In the real world, in real life, you go and work, it doesn't matter whether you're in the public sector or the private sector, you will work as a member of a team, all right? You might be very introverted, you might not like talking. People who are extrovert and like talking all the time might get on your nerves, right? But you just have to learn to adapt to this. So we are simulating working as a member of a team managing the economy. We're also simulating what it's like in the real world. The teams I will announce towards the end of this week. I've not yet decided how many teams there will be. I'm still thinking about that, but I will make the announcement towards the end of this week. And when we start next week, we're going to have a much more detailed breakdown of the game itself. I'm going to show you how to log into the game. I've got some more videos to show you. I'm going to show you the resources that you can access. In addition, of course, to all of the information we have in the PowerPoint slides and the course content. So all of next week will be spent practicing this game, going through various runs of the game. Essentially, you get to manage the economy over 7 years. So you have 7 decisions to make. You'll discuss those decisions as a group. You all agree on what changes you're going to make, what your macroeconomic decisions are, and then you press the button and you see the outcome in terms of your performance on 4 criteria: unemployment, inflation, and the government budget deficit, GDP growth. All right, these are the 4 key variables. So more detail next week, but for the time being, I just want you to start preparing mentally for the kind of skills, the kind of knowledge and application you're going to have to bring to this assessment. So I gave you a little bit of practice at this last week when we did the monetary policy game, when you as individuals got to chair the Fed. So here is the question I asked you, all right? And I'm saying at the outset, chances are you're not going to find this easy, and none of you did find it easy. And a little bit of fun that you had to sort of keep your job at the end of 4 years. And I was encouraging you to make a note of the decisions you were making from one quarter to the next to try and see if there's some kind of pattern to what you might be doing wrong or what indeed you might have been getting right. And I said, have as many attempts as you like, but when you've finished, write a paragraph or 2 documenting what you've learned from this exercise. Okay? So whilst I didn't tell you, what I was doing was encouraging you to critically reflect on your learning experience. What went right? What went wrong? What did you learn? What do you know now that you didn't know before the start of the simulation? And actually writing it down is a very good way of convincing yourself, I did learn something from that exercise. Now, some of you just gave a 1-line or a 2-line answer because you were approaching this as if it were a structured problem as opposed to an unstructured problem. I'm going to give you an example now, and she's going to be blushing as she's sitting in her room at home. But I wanted to just show you an example of what Fatima did in response to this challenge I laid down here. Because she is, without any prompting, without any coaching from me, has actually done a very good critical reflection. So she's telling a story. In the beginning, I faced some difficulties, explaining, how she wrestled with these difficulties and how she, took some notes on the attempts that she did before she got anything approaching a stable rate. She then details what happened in the first attempt, what sort of sparked her curiosity, then what she did in the second attempt, learning on what happened in the first time around, learning from her mistakes. And this is okay, by the way, to acknowledge the fact I made a mistake is a great way of learning. And then in the final paragraph, she's saying, I learned a lot from this game. It shows me how hard it is to reach economic stability and what economists might have to think about if they're going to manage inflation and unemployment. Okay, so if you want to just take a look at the kinds of things that you do when you reflect critically on what you've learned, this is a good example. It's not perfect, I think Fatima will freely acknowledge that with a bit more time and a bit more reflection, she'd have probably been able to give a much more comprehensive response than she gave here. But I did only ask for a few paragraphs. But this is the type of writing that you need to produce if I'm giving you an opportunity to reflect critically on what you've done. All right, it's about saying, we tried this, it went wrong, and being humble about it and being open about it. So what we learned from doing this, where inflation shot through the roof and unemployment went out to double digits, what we learned from this was that you must XYZ, whatever the response was that you took. Okay, so it's learning by doing, it's learning from your mistakes and then documenting what you did and what you learned that's going to get you a high mark. So I'm going to summarize and then I'm going to give you some hints on how you might go about thinking about your thinking while you're thinking to make your thinking better. All right, so first of all, here are some of the characteristics of unstructured problems. First of all, they can't be described completely. Life is complex. Managing an economy is complex. Things happen all the time, some of which you expect, some of which you don't expect. All right? Everybody would have been utterly shocked by the impact that coronavirus has had on our economy here in the UAE and indeed all economies around the world. Some of the problems that we have to deal with in economics and indeed in life have more than one solution, potentially viable solution. We need to think about the options we have open to us. Okay, here's our problem. What do we do? Well, we can do A, we can do B, or we can do C. And then you look at the relative advantages and disadvantages of the possible routes you can take, and then you weigh up the strengths and weaknesses of those arguments, and then and only then do you make a decision. Okay. Lots of the potential solutions can be quite controversial, even amongst experts. So a little later this morning, we'll be talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and I will be pointing out some of the controversies amongst economists. So the way I talk about aggregate supply, for example, is different to the way that the author of your textbook talks about aggregate supply. All right? There are different schools of thought in economics. Right? They have different viewpoints, and the textbook that you have is written by somebody who has a particular viewpoint. There's lots of things that he's written about in that textbook I agree with, but there's lots of things I don't agree with, and I point those out when I prepare PowerPoint slides that deviate from the textbook. So I talk a lot about sustainability. The textbook doesn't. I think we have to, because there's great pressure on the world today to be more sustainable, to control climate change, to make sure that we don't experience more biodiversity loss, to keep pollution at low levels, and so on. So there's controversy amongst economists, we don't all hold the same views. And oftentimes we have incomplete information, which means that it's difficult for us to draw a conclusion that everybody's going to immediately agree with. These are some of the characteristics of unstructured problems. I'm talking about this in the context of economics, but it can also be applied to many other disciplines, many other academic disciplines, and indeed to life more generally. What else? We can have a variety of solution options, all of which we don't know what the outcomes are going to be. Oftentimes we need to address an issue repeatedly over time, because what works today may not work tomorrow. You know, what policies have been effective in the past won't always be effective again in the future. Why? Because the world is a dynamic place and life doesn't stand still. We have to manage things as they change over time. And then the other point that we do, this is now at a higher level of thinking, we can use a problem-solving process that uses information in increasingly complex ways. We're just starting out here in this critical thinking process, but certainly once we've drawn our conclusions about how we're going to approach a particular issue, we also must be very clear about the assumptions that we've made in order to arrive at these conclusions, and be ready to revise our assumptions if things don't go as well as we planned. So here is a little model for you, which hopefully you'll find useful to assist you in this critical thinking process, to be able to think critically, to reflect critically on particular issues. And it's called the stair-step model. And the bottom step, if you will, in this stair-step model is that all of us need some content knowledge. Okay, and I mentioned this before. At the start of a course like this, the first few classes, it's all going to be about content. You need to know about this concept, that concept, and this other concept. Before we can start entering into any kind of discussion, meaningful discussion, we have to have some basic information. You have to have some basic content knowledge, but you also need to have some basic problem-solving skills. This ability to recognize, okay, that is a structured problem. It's a structured question which is inviting a structured answer. And this is an unstructured problem. It's got a number of possible solutions. All right, so if you can make that distinction, then you have these basic problem-solving skills. So let's use an example to illustrate what I mean. I could give you a question, a problem to solve. I could say, right, go and calculate the unemployment rate for UAE. And the first thing you would do is say, right, what is the formula? What is the standard practice for calculating the unemployment rate? You can look in the PowerPoint slides, you can look in your textbook, you can look online, and all around the world there is a fairly uniform approach to the calculation of the unemployment rate. You all know this, right? You all answered the questions in multiple choice quizzes and so on, and it's all about the number of people who are able, willing, available for work, actively looking for work, but are unable to find it as a proportion of the labour force, right? And to be counted in the labour force, you must be actively looking for work, okay? And once you have that formula, you can calculate the unemployment rate, and you can come back and say, Professor, the answer to your question is 2.43%. All right? I've asked you a structured question. It's a structured problem, and you're giving me a very definitive structured answer. Okay, that is the lowest level of the problem-solving process. I might then turn around to you and say 2.43%. That's quite high, isn't it? Do you think that's quite high? And as soon as I ask that question, the problem, in this case it's about unemployment in UAE, it takes on an unstructured dimension, all right? Because we could look at the unemployment statistic and you could say, no, 2.43%, that's really low unemployment if you compare the unemployment in UAE to the unemployment rate in Jordan or Yemen or any other country where the unemployment rate is high, right? The official unemployment rate. But some of you might turn around and say, well, yeah, on the face of it, it does look like it's a low unemployment rate if we can agree that the official unemployment rate in UAE is truly representative of unemployment in the country. It could be, for example, that we have a high underemployment problem in UAE. People have jobs, but they'd actually like to have more work and more pay. It might be that unemployment is artificially low in UAE because a lot of people are employed part-time, all right? Now, I'm making this up, right? I'm making this up. I'm not dealing with real facts here. I'm simply pointing out the fact that once we get past that initial calculation problem, what is the unemployment rate? We get the number, then we discuss. And as soon as we start discussing whether it's good or whether it's bad, the problem takes on an unstructured dimension. So that's the first step in the critical thinking process. And the next step is to actually frame that unstructured problem. So again, I'm going to simplify this because I'm just going to assume there's only two viewpoints here. The viewpoints could be no, the unemployment problem in UAE is not an issue, or it could be the viewpoint that says yes, there is an unemployment problem in UAE because of these reasons, right? So there's a no, there isn't a problem school of thought, and there's a yes, there is a problem school of thought. Okay, and then you frame the problem by saying these are the arguments that will support the yes, there is a problem group, and these are the arguments that will support the no, there isn't a problem. Okay, so the majority of students that I've taught over the years in schools and in universities, they generally get to step 2 without any problem at all. A lot of students at that point say, fine, done my job, I've acknowledged there's a debate about this issue, I've identified the contending perspectives on this issue, I've identified the arguments that support this view and the arguments that support that view, I've done my job. Okay? What many students do not do is go on to the next step where you actually resolve that unstructured problem by evaluating the validity of the arguments put forward by each school of thought. So, for example, there may be the school of thought that says the unemployment problem in UAE is an issue because there's lots of underemployment. Okay, it might be that they can't provide the evidence that confirms that there is an underemployment problem in UAE. Okay, so if the data isn't there, then we can say, well, there's this school of thought that says unemployment in UAE is a problem, but in actual fact, if you look at the statistics on this, there's not many people in the labour force who are working part-time. Those that are doing so voluntarily, and here's the evidence to support that. Okay, so we're actually doing a qualitative analysis about the relative merits of the arguments put forward by different viewpoints. Okay, so again, I'd probably say 90% of the students I've taught won't get beyond step 3. Okay, those students who can go to the next stage, these are the students who typically get grade A's, all right, because they will get to level 3 and they'll identify the strengths and weaknesses of the arguments put forward by different perspectives, different views on a particular issue, and then they'll draw a conclusion to say, well, on the basis of the evidence that we have before us, it would appear as though those people who argue that we do not have an unemployment problem in the UAE, they would appear to have the stronger argument, all right? And these are the reasons why. Okay, so you justify your conclusion. But those who get the grade A's go one step further. They say, however, I am drawing this conclusion based on these assumptions, but if some additional evidence were to become available that showed an alternative, then this would be my conclusion. So the 4th step is where you, having drawn a conclusion, you actually identify the limitations of your own conclusion. Okay, now that is really high level, higher order thinking, and it's something, if any of you have any ambition to go into consultancy, to go and work for one of the big consultancy companies like Ernst Young, KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers and so on, then the job you do when you go and provide consultancy services to the business is that you'll say, right, these are our recommendations, we've examined your problem, these are our recommendations, these are the assumptions we have made in presenting you with these recommendations, and if these assumptions were to change, then our recommendations would be this instead. This is what consultants do. They are very, very careful not to provide recommendations that imply certainty when certainty doesn't exist. And when you're managing the macroeconomy, we do not have certainty. We do not know that COVID-19 is coming around the corner. We may be implementing expansionary monetary policy right now to deal with COVID-19, but as the chair of the Federal Reserve said, and you've got the video in the last class to prove this, he doesn't know what's going to happen, right? He's only suggesting, on the basis of the evidence we have available to us, we think that we don't need to worry about inflation. But he may be wrong. He may be wrong, and lots of chairs of the Federal Reserve in the past have got it wrong. A lot of governments in the past have got it wrong. You, in doing this macroeconomic simulation game, will get it wrong, and that's okay. That's okay as long as you can learn from your mistakes and then reflect on those mistakes, understand why you made them and what you might have to do in the future to avoid making those mistakes again. Now, I don't expect any of you to understand instantly what I'm talking about here. If you've got some idea what I'm talking about, good. You may want to review this video again afterwards on this section to see if you can understand better what I'm saying. If, having taken a look again, you still don't understand, then by all means you can connect with me and I can hopefully provide some additional guidance to you. Many of you, I know, again from experience, will not feel confident that you have the ability to be a good critical thinker. Because it may be that you're struggling with the concepts of economics, and you say, well, if I can't get the basic concepts, how can I start thinking critically about those basic concepts? And I can't think and reflect critically like some other people can. Trust me on this. Trust me, all of you can think critically, right? You just don't know it yet. If I were to sit you in a room and have you in small groups, and I just showed you a picture like this one, and just left you to discuss it, right? I don't need to say anything. I could just show you this picture, and I could divide you into groups, sit back, fold my arms, and then come back 20 minutes, 30 minutes later. You could all tell me what this is about, what this picture is about. You'll tell me about the structured nature of the problem, the unstructured nature of the problem, the contending perspectives on this problem, the various policy options we have to address this problem, okay, what's likely to happen, what your recommendations would be, how you deal with this problem. Hopefully, you'd also say what your assumptions are when you make these recommendations and why you may be wrong, okay? So all of you have an opinion. All of you will be able to put forward a particular viewpoint on a whole host of issues. The fact I've just shown you a picture to stimulate your thinking, I guarantee all of you would have something to say on this picture, okay? If I put it in words on a computer screen or in an examination question, you have to think, I can do it when I look at a picture, why can't I do it when I look at words? Okay, we shall leave it there for the time being, and we'll take a break. Do any of you have any questions at this point? I can see that Anna has asked another question. Can we choose our group? No is the answer. I get to do that. I want to get a good cross-section in each of these groups based on what you've done so far. Okay, so it is 10:14. I'll be back at 10:30. Ali is asking the question, quiz 3 will be the last 4 modules. And that's on, not this Thursday, the Thursday